Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Back in 2020, the Department of Defense, as it was called at the time, introduced the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. It carried the goal of ensuring companies would be able to protect sensitive information when working on government contracts. The program requires contractors handling Federal Controlled Information, or FCI, and Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI, to meet specific cybersecurity standards. Prior to CMMC, DoD contractors were required to self-attest cybersecurity compliance with frameworks set up by the NIST standards. Fast forward to September 10 of last year, and the Department of Defense, or WAR, as it's now known, established an update to the CMMC, basically launching a 3-year rollout of elevated cybersecurity requirements, but with the type of ambiguity that only a government body could really create. The good news is that we have access to guys like today's guest. Mark Knight is a partner and cybersecurity risk advisory leader at Armanino. Join us as he offers details on what the updated CMMC is all about, the challenges with meeting these new compliance standards, and the impact CMMC could have on all manufacturers, regardless of whether you're going after DoD contracts or not. Let's talk about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. About half of our audience is probably very familiar with it. The other half, maybe not so much. So maybe you can kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the CMMC and some of the different changes it's gone and really why it's so important.
So one of the challenges of this conversation is that it's acronym heavy. So I'll do my best to describe and spell everything out as it comes up.
Sure.
So CMMC refers to a set of cybersecurity requirements that are pushed down from the federal government, specifically the Department of War. History is really important here. So why does this exist? If you go to China or other countries and look at their most recent military, fighter jets and other things, Humvees, and compare them to America's version of those, there's a lot of similarities. And I think there was a realization that a lot of the plans, the information around how those things are made, was making its way outside of the United States. And so this was a reaction from the U.S. government to understanding that some of that classified, or in this world, controlled unclassified information, or CUI, which is an important term here, that CUI was making its way outside of the places they intended it to be. So these security requirements are those expectations that the Department of War places on its prime contractors and then its subcontractors to those prime contractors around how they manage two categories of information: controlled unclassified information and federal contract information, or FCI. So depending on what type of information you capture as a prime or as a sub, you are subject to these rules. So then the history comes in. The rules are set in 2010. The guidelines upon which the requirements are set come from NIST. So that's a national standard setting body that comes again from the federal government. And they set out 1 million different frameworks for cybersecurity risk management. And this one is specific. NIST 800-171 R2 is the one that they chose. And that NIST framework is the set of requirements that this is built off of. And so when CMMC went live, version 1.0, it was a set of expectations without requirement. So it might have been written into certain contracts, but generally speaking, there was no enforcement arm built into those requirements. That worked for a little while, but obviously if you put out expectations without a enforcement, you're not going to get a lot of uptake. And so effectively last year, under the current administration, what was a expectation of new version, CMMC 2.0, finally came to light. And so this new set of requirements has a phased rollout, and effectively what used to be expectations and requirements without audits has turned into now an audited standard that contractors are being expected to follow on a go-forward basis. So it's a multi-year rollout for those requirements under CMMC. as of November of last year, the rule is basically any contract directly between DoD and an organization will now have CMMC audit requirements, and then they'll tell you what level is required as a part of those contracts. And because of that, that audit language going into those contracts, now those prime contractors and subcontractors are including that into their subcontracting arrangements and expecting those to go into those relationships on a go-forward basis. So CMMC has been around for a long time, but it's probably showing up in your audience's world and a lot of other folks' world because of these new audit requirements that come with it. And there's a lot more detail that goes into who has to go through these types of audits, what the different levels of compliance are, and everything else. Hopefully we can unpack some of that. But I think the important thing is, if you know that you're working with the Department of War directly, you're a prime, or indirectly as a subcontractor, some level of this is likely to show up in the very near future. Or if you're an organization thinking about working with them, doing some sort of manufacturing down the line with them, this is going to be a requirement that will be baked into contracts on a go-forward basis.
Yeah. No, very well put. Very succinctly summarized there. That was great. I think just a couple of things, because I've seen different areas of this, different people talking about different things. Who actually conducts these audits? Who is the accountable party? Is it the Department of War, or is it a third party, or who manages that?
That's a good segue into the different levels of compliance. So level 1 means you only have federal contract information, FCI. That is a self-attestation standard. It's 15 requirements, kind of your baseline expectations of cybersecurity. While it's unlikely that you would go through an audit, there's still the possibility of an audit directly from DoD. They have some different departments that would do these types of examinations. But ultimately, if you're under level 1, you're likely doing a self-audit. If you hit level 2, meaning you have CUI in your environment, then you're subject to either a self-attestation or a third-party attestation. Self-attestations, when the rule came out, it was the expectation that most level 2 providers might be able to do self-attestation. However, with 2.0 coming out and the rules that were communicated November of last year, they're saying somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of organizations that have CUI and meet level 2 are going to be required to have a third-party audit. Those audits are done by independent assessors. They're called C3PAOs, Certified Third-Party Attestation Organizations. There's a very small list of independent private companies that are approved to do this. That's a big part of why this took so long to roll out. They had to set up an accreditation body for those assessors, as well as the professionals who do this type of assessment work and consulting work, and that took time. They're pushing that forward. So there's a small list of assessors that exist today. A lot of folks are going through the process of becoming C3PAOs. If you are a level 2, you will get in your contract told you need to meet level 2 and you have to have an independent assessment performed. So that's going to be the vast majority of especially subcontractors to primes. Level 3 is the next version. This is if you're holding that CUI, and there's a possibility that you could be a direct target of a nation-state threat actor, essentially. There's a lot more language around how they make that decision, but it's a level that the DoD can force on you. And I'm going to mix up DoD and DOW all the time. Apologies in advance. Yeah. Hard to change management's hard, right? So meeting those requirements for level 3, that is the point at which you have an assessment performed by the government. That assessment still means you have to meet levels 1 and 2. You have an additional set of requirements for level 3. You have a C3PAO perform a level 2 audit on you, and then that C3PAO registers you with the DoD effectively, and you go through a government audit on top of all of those things to validate that, 1, you're meeting level 3, and 2, that the Department of War agrees with your assessors' rankings of how well you're meeting all of those requirements.
No, the Department of Defense, Department of War, I slip in and out of them as well. I think we're all on the same page there.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
Yeah. When we talk about these audits, Mark, how much time are we talking here? Are these lengthy processes? What's the expectation there?
So The requirements under level 2, NIST 800-171, it's 110 controls with 300 assessment objectives roughly. So in order for a C3PAO to perform an assessment of you, they have to perform an evaluation of how well you're meeting all 300 of those audit objectives that tie to the 110 controls. The process of making sure that you are doing all of the requirements under NIST 800-171, as well as there's some additional requirements that come direct from CMMC that aren't stated in NIST. The process of making sure you have all of that documentation squared away, you have the policies, procedures, processes, and the technology in place around your CUI. It's locked away, essentially. Only people that need access to it have access to it, and all the other things you have to do. That process is pretty long for most organizations. 12 months is a pretty good runway. Some folks can do it faster, some take longer, but it's a long runway to get there and get everything documented. Before you sign up with your C3PAO for your assessment, you really want to make sure all of that stuff is ready for audit. If you're at that point where you are ready for audit, everything's documented, you have examples of everything pulled, screenshots of settings, all the policies, everything else, the actual audit itself can be rather fast. 1 to 3 weeks is allegedly possible, but that would mean everything was perfectly written up. You're in an ideal situation. A way that C3PAOs are handling relationships is sometimes they'll do a pre-audit engagement with the candidate because they haven't been through this before, and basically say, hey, if we were doing your certification audit as of today, these are the findings we would have. They then give the candidate time to go and fix those things and then perform the full-blown assessment at a later date. That's one potential relationship. But I think the answer is if you're ready and you've gone through all the steps that are required to be ready, the assessment is likely to be something that you can knock out within a reasonable timeline, 1 to 2 months. However, because there are so few C3PAOs out there, getting on their calendar is a challenge. So if you're looking at the requirements saying, hey, this is going to show up in my contract in 2026, I'm likely to have to prove that I've been audited by 2027 because of the phased rollout that they're doing, it's probably a good idea to have a consultant in place walking you through the path of getting ready, but also be on the calendar with the assessor as soon as possible because they're scheduling pretty far out.
So, and maybe this kind of bleeds into that whole phase in that they're doing with this newest rendition of the CMMC. But if you have everything ready for audit and you're in the midst of the auditing process, can you still qualify for some of these contracts, or do you have to pass the audit before you can be considered?
It will depend primarily on the prime contractors and what they're willing to do in contractual relationships. The expectation right now is that at some point in their vendor management process, they will have a go, no go decision of we can work with you if you have proof of certification, or we cannot contract with you, period, if you have without proof of certification. This is crystal ball, but I don't think that it's going to be as black and white as what's kind of written into the rule right now because of, there are probably, I think the last statistic I heard is that there are at least 3,000 organizations that as of today would need to go through assessment. Yeah. And there are maybe 100 C3PAOs, probably less. So there's not the capacity to do that number of assessments in that timeline, much less give all of those companies the year they need to get all of their requirements documented in the way that they need to document them to be ready for an assessment. So it will be up to, we're usually talking about the prime and sub relationships here. If you're a prime contractor, you've been working with these requirements since day one, and Lockheed Martin isn't going to be affected by this in-house. Yeah. They're being affected by this because of all the subcontractors that they're working with. But it's going to be a competitive advantage to have early certification for a while because it is a risk mitigating factor for manufacturers that are able to say, hey, we have this certification level. And that could drive some M&A activity down the road as well as organizations look at the cost of being compliant and making decisions on whether they want to do everything in-house, join teams, go through a merger, or abandon that type of contracting because the cost is not worth the price.
Yeah, it's interesting, the different actual opportunities that could be opened up to different manufacturers because of this certification. I was hoping you could also clarify some of the phase-in dynamics of this, because I've seen some different time periods. What are we working with here right now in terms of hard deadlines, I guess?
Yeah. Generally speaking, November is the month on which each of these requirements will be. November of last year, so from that point going forward, it should mean all new contracts coming from the DoD have an audit requirement. They will state the type of information coming to the organization and whether an independent or self-attestation is acceptable. The next requirement is November of 2026. That is the expected point at which proof of certification should be in place. However, again, I think that's where there might be some movement, but you can never tell.
Absolutely. So we know some manufacturers are struggling to get up to speed and to hit some of these deadlines. Is it because of the factors you just mentioned? It's cost, it's resources. Are there other factors at play as well?
Yeah, there are a lot of driving factors for why compliance can be challenging.
Yeah.
What comes with CMMC is a bunch of technical requirements, and probably when you think about the level of effort, far more documentation requirements. So this requires an organization to have policies and procedures documented on the 14 core areas and 110 controls that are required under NIST 800-171. That sitting down and writing 14 new policies, defining the scope of where CUI exists within your organization, identifying all of the security assets and technical assets that touch that CUI. That is a long process for a lot of organizations and likely can't be done in-house unless you have a larger IT organization, probably with a CISO as its own independent role. But if you're a quality and risk management person or a sole CIO who's now responsible for ensuring that all of these things in place, you could have every technical requirement documented or implemented in your organization and still have a large lift when it comes to documentation because of putting these policies, doing these trainings, and effectively pushing all of this stuff out across the organization. So that's one of the biggest factors. There's some tricks to getting through that process. Obviously, bringing folks in to assist with the implementation phase is a big deal. Evaluating all the vendors that you use and making sure you're working with vendors that can provide in that area, whether it's a IT organization that handles your help desk. Are they level 2 certified? Are they going to be, there are different sets of subcontractor requirements that you have to consider, third-party vendors that are going to help you work through that. But generally speaking, no one accidentally becomes CMMC certified, right? It's a very thoughtful, engaging process that you have to go through and put in all of these new requirements. And the first year will likely be a big lift. But once you've designed it and implemented it, the maintenance, hopefully that goes back to something that an organization can maintain internally, or just with kind of some new processes, obviously, but not the same level of effort every year.
Absolutely. So, and I know this is tough because essentially you're looking at 110 boxes that CMMC is looking for everybody to check, but is there a focal point in terms of, is it about detection? Is it about endpoints? Is it about response? Is there sort of a focal point or a driving factor that really pushes CMMC forward?
Comprehensive framework, so it put in expectations across the entire organization. I think some of the challenges for most organizations are going to be around segmenting off CUI from the rest of the business. So you have to show a business justified reason for why anyone who has the ability to get to CUI can get to CUI as a part of this security plan that you have to develop. And so you can't just say, well, it's easier for us to just apply this to our entire organization. almost no one can make that business case in a way that an assessor would agree that that makes sense. So segmenting off the CUI into an enclave of some sort, a secure area, um, that is the technical side of the equation. And then the organizational side, it's really putting what looks and feels like an internal audit function in place around your organization. Who's going in and checking to make sure we're meeting all these requirements, documenting it on a regular basis.
Do these audits become public record? Is this kind of kept under wraps a little bit? Does it have to be released out?
It's not public record what you do with your C3PAO. There is a way, and I'm not as familiar with the DoD registration process. They're not just going to publish a list of every level 2 manufacturer out there. They don't.
Okay.
That would be great information for China to have access to.
Right. That's where I was going. Yeah.
Or some other threat actor. So that they're not going to publish that. Although I think there's going to be a point where someone really wants to be able to identify, hey, who are the folks in the aerospace industry who have this certification, so I can go to them and ask them to help me with this process. But it will not be published. I think the challenge is going to be, can you get a contract or not, right? That's going to be the primary. If you say you're level 2 certified or that you're going to get a level 2 certification, organizations at some point, those primes are not going to sign a contract with you until you have proof. And when that switch is flipped, that's going to be a go, no go decision that will drive that. But I don't think it's going to be published. And there's no indication that they're planning on publishing externally the results of those types of audits. Now, if you're a public company, you might have regulatory communication obligations that go from the SEC and other organizers. But if you're a private company and you're just dipping your toe into this, or you're considering a contract, or it's just been written into a contract and it never was before, you're going to have a process that's going to be direct between you and your prime that will likely flesh out where you stand.
Sure. No, and it just came to mind because everything right now is a double-edged sword in cybersecurity. On one side, it'd be great to have sort of that template for some of the smaller manufacturers to look at and say, this is my roadmap. But then you're also potentially giving the bad guys a bunch of target lists here in terms of who didn't meet certification or who is not going after it. So it's just kind of an interesting dynamic to dissect a little bit.
Absolutely.
So when we look at this, what are some of the things that you're doing, Mark, with Armanino to really help manufacturers? We've gone over a lot of the pain points here. There's got to be some good news out there too, right?
I think the good news in this space is that this fits well into the governance, risk, and compliance GRC world that has been baked out for public companies under other criteria over the last decade. So there are a lot of GRC platform providers in this space that really help tremendously with the implementation and documentation processes that can be really cumbersome for large organizations. So let me just give some examples. If you were to kind of do it yourself, bake your own, you'd have to sit down and write policies, read the NIST 800-171 framework, write a policy for all 14 of the areas and some additional policies, making sure that they meet those criteria. You'd have to document how you meet all 110 controls, and you'd have to gather evidence to prove that you're doing all of those things internally on SharePoint or however you want to do that. You're capturing all of that information. That's requiring a human to sit down and do a lot of reading and a lot of writing. You're still going to have to do that even if you use a GRC platform. And again, there are a million providers out there in this space. But what those platforms are doing is they're helping with templates. They're helping with a location with which you can upload all of that documentation and store it, helping with document retention, document history. They're going to have some things to tie in to your compute environments and do some testing for you, pulling documentation. So there are some shortcuts that I think a lot of organizations will see that the cost of that platform is worth it to them to cut out some of the man hours. And then the other side, what we're doing, how we're helping organizations is that readiness process. How do you define your system security plan? How do you define the scope of what's going to be subject to these requirements, where will CUI exist in your organization? What are the data flow diagrams? What assets exist in that? How do you know that your network is properly segmented, right? Are you doing things like internal penetration testing to validate that segmentation? To say, hey, we think we've locked this down, but we're actually having an assessor come in and validate that before you have the C3PAO come in when it's, for all the marbles, if you will.
No, it's interesting, in going through all of those different things, especially when you talk about segmentation and asset visibility, two huge challenges, not just in manufacturing. I think throughout cybersecurity, there's going to be a lot of internal discovery, I would think, as well here. And getting this certification, you are really, it feels like helping yourself just in general as well, right?
Yeah, the NIST framework is not some set of crazy requirements that they came up with that go above and beyond what a good cybersecurity risk management program should look like. This is, very similar to many of the other NIST standards and very similar to what you'd get from a lot of other governing bodies on best practices around cyber risk management. So are you going to improve your organization through this process? 100%. Is it above and beyond what you would have chosen to do from a risk management standpoint? Maybe. But the DoD has decided maybe not. This is what we are going to require you to do because of the level of sensitivity of that information that they're sending.
No, makes sense. Whenever we talk about it, and you touched on this too, some of the complications that go with any type of certifications or compliance audits or anything like that, very complex, very time consuming. One of the solutions that's been thrown out there is the use of artificial intelligence. And that seems to be one of the things AI is very good at in terms of consolidating information, boiling it down. Have you seen AI being plugged in here or maybe in other compliance type areas? What's maybe your general thoughts there?
Yes, AI obviously is ubiquitous across all of our different worlds. Where it plays into CMMC compliance, I mentioned GRC tools, governance, risk, and compliance tools. Those are primarily helping you develop your documentation, go through the discovery process, come up with remediation plans and programs. AI is heavily baked into most of those tools. And when you evaluate them, you really want to find the ones that are going to make that process easier. No one wants to write a policy from absolute scratch. You really want to make it apply to your organization, but get a lot of the templates, provided to you along the way. I will caution, however, when we think of large language models and CUI, while it's possible that there might be an LLM that has L2, I guess they would likely go through FedRAMP, which is a sister certification process for software providers in the defense space. But there are likely going to be some players in that area in order to run LLMs. But when it comes to direct CUI, most manufacturers that I'm seeing, they're not exposing their CUI environments directly to large language models. There'll probably be some that'll build their own inside and keep it locked away, essentially run an internal LLM for doing that kind of computational work that those are so good at doing. But I think when we think about AI, it's really about enabling you to do a better job of meeting this compliance, not doing the compliance for you just now.
Yeah. Well, I think with manufacturers, this makes a lot of sense. They've been dealing with machine learning and automation environments for decades. So to be able to plug something in and develop something internally, not really beyond their scope as far as that goes, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information. So it makes a lot of sense.
And I will say, where this hits the manufacturing industry particularly hard is everyone knows that a lot of that machine software is ancient and challenging to update and sometimes very expensive to update. And the excuse of cost prohibitive updates to software on your machines may not be a valid excuse to have a vulnerable CNC machine on your shop floor that's capturing CUI. So those types of decisions are going to be challenging. One thing that I'm hopeful for, though, is if you've spoken to programmers that are using LLMs, one of the things they'll tell you is it's really good at translating older programming languages into modern programming languages. So I'm hopeful that a lot of these providers are going to be able to provide security updates for equipment that was challenging to update in the past. So that might be one silver lining that's out there. The downside is that everything that we're using, the threat actors are using as well. So discovery is becoming easier for them. Writing new exploits is becoming easier for them. So it's a battle. Most of the money's on the side of the defenders, so we do have that advantage, but there's a lot of novel uses that are happening out there in the wild that we're going to be subject to as this all happens.
Yeah, it will be interesting. I mean, the OT environment, it's notorious, obviously, for all the things you just mentioned, being very difficult. And even when we have that sort of translation dynamic in place through AI, it's still figuring out how to plug it in. And sometimes those connection points also leave us vulnerable to more bad stuff happening down the way. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues to work through as well. You know, Mark, you've kind of danced around it a little bit in terms of how things have been going on the street, but in general, how are manufacturers responding to this? What's the general vibe? Are people pissed off? Are they grin and bearing it? Are they embracing it? What's sort of the dynamic out there?
We've seen all of the above. This is particularly hard for the smaller players, right? The smaller your organization is, the harder it is to implement a control framework that has 110 requirements and requires all this documentation and manual work on top of it. So for those where this is either a surprise or implemented a little more heavily than they were expecting, there is a lot of frustration. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see some of those contractors, subcontractors decide this is no longer worth it for us. And I do also think this is where you're going to see some M&A activity in that space. A lot of the smaller shops are going to have to join forces with larger ones that have a larger IT organization and compliance organization that can walk them through this process. I will say that the flip side of it is this has been ambiguous as to how it was going to roll out, who was going to be responsible for conducting the audits and everything else for a long time. A lot of that ambiguity was swept away a lot faster than we thought it would be. So that is good in that there's clarity. Now, I've kind of mentioned maybe there's going to be a little flexibility down the road of when things get actually forced out down the line. But we have a pretty good idea that this is going to be a firm requirement. And that way you can say, hey, I know what I have to do by the end of 2026, and I can build a roadmap to get to that point. And before this point, it was a lot more of ambiguity about who's certifying the assessors, and do we really have to meet this, or do we really have to have a third party assess us, and all those other things. So it should give more clarity. Call that a silver lining or not, but it does help some folks.
No, first when you said a government program being, having ambiguity, not a surprise there. So the fact that there's more clarity coming, I think that's only going to be helpful, but it also helps companies make decisions whether they want to pursue this or not. They can get in or out as quickly as they need to, or they feel is best for their organization. So positives there as well. So looking either at CMMC, a lot of the different regulatory efforts that are going on right now, or maybe even just beyond that, Mark, are there some big trends that you're seeing sort of coming down the pike in the next, year and a half, something like that?
I think a convergence of vendors is likely to happen, especially in the highly regulated space. So you're going to see a lot of people that had on-premise environments or were using, sort of non-government cloud AWS environments. They're going to be moving to a smaller subset of vendors for their IT management, for their cloud hosting, and for a number of other sort of applications in this space. So I do think there's going to be a convergence. I kind of alluded to the M&A activity. I think that's going to ramp up very quickly as some of these requirements are fleshed out because of the costs of going through compliance. So if you're heavily reliant on a prime contractor for most of your revenue, it may make sense for you to go through the process of becoming CMMC L2 certified yourself. But if it's a smaller part of your business, it's a side gig, that's where people might be spinning off parts of their manufacturing processes and selling them to folks who have already figured this out. And I think that consolidation is going to drive a lot of larger organizations serving, the large defense contractors. So we'll see, but that seems like a likely effect of this.
Well, the merger thing is nothing new to manufacturing. We've seen that in so many other different subsectors, whether it's food, chemical, electronics, companies coming together for a lot of these same reasons, for compliance or for just product gaps or whatever the case is. So that makes a lot of sense. Consolidation, I have to admit, that's another one of those double-edged sword dynamics where that can be very positive in unifying companies or taking away some of the things that some of these smaller firms do really well and sort of leaving potentially an opening in the marketplace. So that is going to be something really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I am really curious to see how this affects pricing. How well can these subcontractors push through the cost of their certification to the prime, and how well can the prime push that through to the DoD? There is a cost associated with this. The audit from the see-through PAO is just one small part of that overall effort, right? It's a technology effort. It's likely a consulting effort, and then an assessment effort. It's an ongoing maintenance process. So it's really enforcing a level of cybersecurity risk management that I'm used to seeing at, Fortune 500 companies onto manufacturers that are obviously a lot smaller and working with very different resource pool.
Yeah. Some of those subcontractors, are surprisingly small, especially if it's a software product, a different type of technology that's really just being developed for that niche purpose, whether it's military or whatever the case may be. No, very interesting. So the last question I got for you, Mark, you're dealing with a very unique subset of manufacturing and really suppliers across the board. As you alluded to, there's a lot of confidential information here. There's some big risk involved. When you're going through this and working with companies, is there anything that you come across that causes some concern, maybe keeps you up at night a little bit thinking about, man, how are we going to figure this one out?
Yeah, we do a little bit of cyber due diligence work in the PE world. And the number of times that we look at an organization that is signing up as if they are meeting a set of regulatory requirements, whether CMMC or something ITAR, around international trafficking. They're signing up that they're meeting these requirements, but when you ask questions, you get concerned about whether or not they're actually following and have all of those procedures in place. That, to me, is kind of what keeps me up at night, is people are signing off that they're doing things, not understanding the gravity of that sign-off. This is civil and criminal liability that goes along with stating that you are meeting these requirements. And I don't know that organizations are really assessing that risk properly when either making an acquisition decision or even deciding to take on this new customer and signing up for it. So it's not just in the defense industrial base where that exists, right? It could be in banking, it could be in other, GDPR and other regulatory frameworks. But the number of organizations that are, because of a salesperson or because of the lucrative deal that's coming down the pipeline, making the decision to sign off on something without fully understanding the gravity of that decision is scary. And so that would keep me up at night.
Well, and the reason I asked that, I'm not trying to end on like a downer note here or scare anybody, but these are the types of things we need to share and talk about more often throughout the industry. And I think there is, what you just alluded to there, I don't think there's anything nefarious going on with any of those companies. They just figure, I've done this before, I've got this taken care of. And that mindset permeates throughout manufacturing in particular, and it's why a lot of folks don't do enough. They don't go the extra steps they need to really defend their company, their assets, and their people.
Yeah, and in all things compliance, it's better to be honest, because if you give a level at best effort, if you're upfront and you're found to have had a breach or you're found to have been out of compliance, what we've seen from penalties and criminal litigation is the more dishonest you are, the stronger they come down on you. So I think being upfront and honest and truly understanding what you're signing up for is the most important thing. And then you can make a business decision. And not everyone's going to decide that it's worth doing that, but know the full impact before making that business decision.
Absolutely. Great stuff, Mark. Thanks so much for the time, man. Really appreciate it. You really offered a lot of clarity to something where I think there is a little bit of muddy water floating around in terms of people trying to understand it. So really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. And to learn more about the work he and his colleagues are up to, check them out at armanino.com. I'd also like to thank you for joining us, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check out Security Breach wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Mark Knight, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.